Have you ever wondered where different languages come from, or in fact, where language itself comes from? Well, today, in order to understand where English as a language comes from, the first thing we have to think about is, where does language come from? Now, I think it's helpful to think about language changing as a little bit like a cell dividing. We talk about there being maybe a parent language, and that parent language then becomes two different languages. It isn't that there are two languages that meet together and then make another one in the way that people reproduce, and two people will have one child. Instead, you'll have one parent language that might have multiple other languages under it. We don't know, if there was a first world language that all other languages descend from, or if there were many of them. Many have hypothesized that there's one that's called proto-world, sometimes it's called, or something like this. But we don't know anything about that. But we do know that there are these huge language families, and one that we know very well is the Indo-European language family, where all the languages in this family descend from a language that we call Proto-Indo-European. And English is in this language family, and there are lots of other languages in this huge family. I mean, languages is varied as, we have English and Welsh and Latin and Greek and Lithuanian and Russian and and Persian and Hindi and Bengali and Hittite, and languages all throughout Europe, Asia, and indeed parts of Africa. So Indo-European is this huge language family. Now, why then is it that everyone who descends from this language, why don't we all then speak the same language? If we're using the metaphor of a cell dividing, why is it that then Proto-Indo-European, when the cell divided and went from one to the other, when a cell divides, we assume that each child cell, daughter cell, will have the same genetic structure, basically, of the parent cell. Well, in fact, geography has a lot to do with this issue. It has to do with who you talk with every day. We read in Genesis chapter 11, verse 9, we read about how God confused the languages of the people at the Tower of Babel, and it makes the point that he scattered them about the world. And in there we see the truth that language is closely associated with geography. If you think about it, that's an assumption that you make, that people in one area will speak one language and people in another area will speak another language, and people in one area will speak one dialect of the language and people in another area will speak another dialect of that language. But the reason that is the case has to do not with whether there are mountains in this area or trees in this area, but rather because you speak the language that you and everyone else that you know speaks every day. When language change is always happening, but it's very slow. You speak the same language as your grandparents, and you and your grandparents can communicate just fine. And your grandparents spoke with their grandparents, and their grandparents spoke with their grandparents, and slowly over time, you start to have the language will change. Okay, but then why don't all languages change together? Well, again, it has to do with this community. Who are you talking with every day? So what usually will happen is you'll have one community that speaks one language, and that one language then will divide because the community becomes separated geographically and they're not in daily conversation with one another. So, for example, let's say that we speak language X and we all speak language X, but then because of flooding or because we're following herds or just because we've grown so big we need new farmlands, some of our people go and they settle a village on the other side of the mountain. Now their children are going to speak the same language as the children on the first side of the mountain, but what will happen over time is slowly both communities that speak the same language, language X, slowly their languages will drift, and they won't necessarily drift off in the same direction. In fact, they probably won't. And so every generation, they'll understand one another a little bit less, a little bit less, a little bit less, until finally, we can't really say that either one speaks language X. The community on one side of the mountain speaks language Y, and the community on the other side of the mountain speaks language Z. And that's how Indo-European divided up into all sorts of other languages. And one of the language groups that Indo-European divided into is a language family that we call Germanic. Germanic is a smaller language family within the broader Indo-European language family. And in that Germanic language family is the language English. Now, sometimes people will hear this and they'll think, well, wait, so you're saying that English comes from German? And I hear that all the time. Students will go on to Wikipedia and they'll read it and they'll say, oh, English comes from German. That isn't, in fact, how it happens at all. Instead, it's more correct to say that English and German come from the same common language, which is a language called Germanic. And so what happened was the speakers of Germanic then separated, in this case by the English Channel, and I'll explain in a little bit how that happened. But they separated, and slowly, generation after generation, those two languages changed until on one side of the channel, people spoke the language that we consider German. On the other side of the channel, people spoke the language that we consider English. Okay, so now that we understand that, we can begin to think about the origins of English itself particularly. Now, we divide English language up into three periods: Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. And Old English is the period that we're going to talk about today. Old English, we usually give the traditional starting date of Old English as being about 449 AD. And we're going to talk about why that date's important. And then we have the traditional ending date of it being 1066 AD. So, where does this come from? Well, we have to go back before 449 to the time when the people who we think of as the English did not, in fact, live in England at all. In fact, in those days, England was Britain, and the people who lived there were the Britons. And the Britons, they spoke a language that's part of the Indo-European language family, but not part of the Germanic language family. So it is, at best, a very distant cousin to English. And they were part of the Roman Empire, and had been part of the Roman Empire for many centuries. And they had become Romanized. They were some early adopters of Christianity, so the Britons were a Christian people. And then what happens is, of course, in the 5th century, the Roman Empire begins to collapse. And as the Roman Empire begins to collapse, you begin to see other sorts of effects. And so, according to some of the histories from that time, basically what happened was the Britons were looking for mercenaries to help defend them from their enemies, since the Romans weren't going to do that anymore. And so they contacted some people who lived across the English Channel and spoke a Germanic language, peoples that we call the Angles and the Saxons, and we'll just call them the Anglo-Saxons. And they asked the Anglo-Saxons to come and fight for them in exchange for land to settle in. Now, we know from some archaeological digs and things like this, we know that there were other settlements that happened, but this story, that the way that that the medieval people understood it, is really close to being the way that it happened, because about that time, as the Roman Empire begins to collapse, you start to see these people coming over from what we might consider Germany today. And of course, they speak this Germanic language. Now, right there you begin to see they speak Germanic, and we see that geographic separation from the English Channel. We see the people who will eventually, their language will drift off and become German, and the people on the island, their language will drift off and become English. And so the Anglo-Saxons, slowly, generation after generation, their language begins to change. But before that happens, something else has to happen. That is that England, as we understand it, has to stop being Britain and become England. And that happens very quickly. It doesn't take long before conflict arises between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons. And this starts really a century and a half of warfare between the two. And eventually the Anglo-Saxons win. And they become the dominant people on the island that we now call England named for the Anglo-Saxons. Now, and so from 449, which is the traditional date that the Britons invited these Anglo-Saxon war chiefs to come and help them in exchange for land, up to 1066. In that time, some important things happened that affected the language itself. One thing is, I mentioned before that the Britons were Christians. Well, the Anglo-Saxons were not. They worshipped the Norse pantheon of gods, like Odin and Thor and those sorts of gods. Well, eventually what happened is around the beginning of the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxons begin to themselves become Christianized too. They eventually adopt Christianity, and so England was not Christian, was not Christian, and then the Britons became Christian, and then it's defeated by pagans, and then they become Christianized. And so when the Anglo-Saxons become Christianized, they start to bring in a lot of words from the church, ecclesiastical words. In fact, words like ecclesiastical that come from a Latin origin. So we start to get a lot of loan words in from a language that is not of the Germanic language family. The other thing that happens is there is a lot of close connection between the Anglo-Saxons and the people that we would call the Vikings. And in fact, arguably the Anglo-Saxons were themselves a kind of Viking people. And so what they spoke a language called Old Norse. And sometimes we look at that. Sometimes we look at them. We think about the Vikings as coming and raiding and pillaging, and that certainly happened. But also the Vikings came and they settled in the same way that the Anglo-Saxons came to settle. And the Anglo-Saxons often called them the Danes. And so that didn't have such a strong effect on the language itself, but there's a lot of close cultural contact that you see in the literature from the time with the Danes. And in fact, at one point, the Danes control parts of England we call the Danelaw, and they controlled almost every kingdom of England, Wessex being the only kingdom that they did not control at that time. And their language is also a Germanic language. And so, for example, in some literature like Beowulf, you'll see like Beowulf is going from one area of Scandinavia, then he's going to Denmark, and he's talking to them, and as if they all speak the same language. And we know that actually their languages were still pretty closely related to this original Germanic language, so they could still communicate a lot better in those days than maybe modern English speaker, modern German speaker, modern Danish speaker, modern Swedish speaker, modern Icelandic speaker could understand one another today. We really see those as being foreign languages today. And so over the centuries, as the Anglo-Saxons lived in England up until 1066, what we see is the Christianization and the contact that they have with the other Germanic peoples. We see these things as having an effect on the language and an effect on the literature. And this continues until 1066, where there's this big event called the Battle of Hastings, in which the Anglo-Saxons are defeated by Norman invaders led by William the Bastard or William the Conqueror. And they speak a language which is also Indo-European, but comes from a different language family in that, and is more closely related to French. And in that case, what happens is you have got a very small minority of the people, maybe a percentage of the people who speak language from one language family, and 99% speak another language from another language family. They speak Norman French, and the majority of people, the vast majority, speak Old English. But what happens is, because the people speak Norman French are the dominant people, because they rule everything, they have a sharp impact on English, and there are a lot of sudden changes that happen starting in 1066, and that's when the Middle English period begins. And so really the Old English period starts when the Anglo-Saxons come over from the continent, and they begin dwelling among and fighting with the Britons, and it ends eventually when the Normans come from France, and they then defeat the Anglo-Saxons in 1066.